Well, good afternoon. One of the critical aspects of any industry is, of course, selling its products. And so what I'm going to talk about, and my paper contains many more details. I'm going to focus on many of the illustrations from four British lift catalogs that are from very distinct periods and very distinct companies. The first, Bradbury and Thornborough from 1887. They were based in Manchester, and they were a general manufacturing firm who thought, well, if they could make revolving shutters and self-acting sun blinds and swivel partitions, well, how hard could hoists and lifts be? And it's just another machine. And so this is the front of the catalog, very short, 22 pages. This is the rear, and I've not had the pleasure of Manchester, but there's the cathedral, so there's where the works were. And so neither front or back do we see anything about lifts. And I'm going to pause here because I paid very close attention to one of the directions in writing the papers, which, as an American, I knew I was supposed to pay attention. Very clear, always say lift, not elevator. And I thought, right, I'm looking at lift catalogs. Historians, like engineers, depend on evidence. What could possibly go wrong? There are only 2 pages in this catalog on lifts. Notice that word and that word. And if we focus in on the descriptive paragraph, the word elevator is here 3 times. Now, this was not very helpful to me because I was trying to figure out, well, wait, this is a British company. Now, I don't know why. The word elevator obviously existed in the UK mostly to refer to material conveyors. That's how it would have been used. But nonetheless, here it is. And the text is of interest if we think about some of the papers we've heard thus far, particularly if we focus on this. Safety apparatus is fitted when required. When would it not be required? And in the 19th century, one of the phrases you often find is something like this: on the most approved principle, which either means that it's so common I'm not going to tell you, or I have no idea, and you'll just trust me and we'll put some sort of safety on it, which may have been the case with Bradbury and Thornborough. If we extract the 2 primary illustrations we have on the left, primarily a hand-powered hoist. You can just read the ropes here and here, and that's the full cage in an industrial setting, just a platform, open platform, no safety barriers of any kind. This could have been attached to a belt for a drive. And then this is their passenger lift, again, belt-driven, and we see the engine there. The illustration has a couple of strange things that I haven't sorted out yet. I have no idea what those circles are. And they sort of reappear there, and they're not in quite the right place for some sort of deflecting sheave. I don't know, but this was actually fairly common in the 19th century. A general firm saying, how hard can this be? So they would market lifts and hoists, often for industrial purposes. So we move from someone incorporating lifts in general work to a proper lift company, Waygood Co. Before Waygood Otis, just Waygood. The much different catalog, much more refined in its appearance. This is from 1889. Very proper 19th century, a guide to intending purchasers. This is all very straightforward. And after struggling with Bradbury and Thornborough, the word elevator, I thought, I'm on safe ground here. This is a lift company. What could go wrong? They build lifts and elevators. Now, at this point, I began to think that they wrote the instructions just to cause me some sort of problem. And in the text, Waygood also is very clear. They say, we're talking about hydraulic lifts, and then in brackets, they say, or elevators, as they're referred to in the United States. It is possible because, and it's a bit small to read, Waygood, of course, was throughout the UK. They were also in Australia, and interestingly enough, they had a branch office in Holland. There's a connection there that should be explored. They may have been considering a branch in the United States because they pursued several American patents. So there may be a reason for that, but it's the rest of the information that reminds us, and it's sort of, we built hydraulic lifts and elevators for all sorts of uses, and here, even though we're in 1889, they're still having to remind us where you're supposed to use these. Clubs, restaurants, offices, hotels, mansions, factories, public and private buildings, because it's still relatively new. In this catalog, there are only 4 illustrations. This is Waygood's biggest product for the 19th century. Direct plunger, hydraulic lift, no counterbalance, but with a secondary cylinder that was weighted that could provide variable water pressure as the lift rose up. And they also advertise this as their most aesthetic solution because there's no cables. And this is where lifts were often placed in a stairwell, so you just had this sort of simple cylinder rising up. A very beautiful car. Whoops, sorry. Beautiful car, and you had no cables, no counterweights, none of that. But they also manufactured what they called their low-pressure lift, or suspended lift, which we see here, which is powered by a horizontal cylinder with both fixed sheaves and then moving sheaves at this end, and it was a multiplying action on the rope. If the piston moved a foot, the lift would move 3 or 4 feet, something like that. And this exactly parallels American developments at the time, and it's very difficult, even in the 19th century, to sort out who's doing what first. Because although we tend to think, we have instant communication today, the Americans read the British engineering magazines, the Brits read the American magazines, and the French and the German. Everyone knew what was going on. So we have sort of that system, and not quite unique, but somewhat unique, their high-pressure suspended lift, where with weights and a vertical cylinder, they could get a higher pressure, again, a suspended lift. And with all of these illustrations, if you sort of take your time and sort of go through them carefully, there's just this hint of a pit represented here in this sort of recognizing the need for that. Perhaps the most interesting illustration in this catalog is this. Sort of combining everything, it's a sort of classic way to advertise. So here's our most prominent lift, sort of direct plunger lift. We've got a comfortable bench, very common in the 19th century, a nice businessman sitting there. But notice what's not there. We see no operator. He's not driving this. And there's no means of action. There's no shipper rope or how we control it. On the other side is, below the floor, in the absolutely perfect place for maintenance, is the horizontal cylinder. And there we see the chain going up. And there's our worker's lift, and he's holding the shipper rope. But it's this in the center that really interests me. Even though the perspective's slightly off, we have a boiler, we have an accumulator, this massive weight to give me the water pressure I need. We have the steam lines, we have all the controls here, and even though it's slightly off, there's more detail in this image than I've ever seen of how this machine room might have actually worked. So it gives us some insight, even to the coal piled here to feed into the boiler. So it gives us a little insight into that working world. In the catalog, finally, the Waygood, on the back cover, and this is, you just read, it says the Australian Waygood Elevator Company, which is the origin of this catalog. Because Waygood, for a very brief period of time, had a branch outpost in Australia, which raises other questions about technology transfer, whether it's the colonies or other places in the 19th century, is how did this technology move about? And the only thing that tells us that this is from Australia is it's stamped. It's the exact same catalog, and they were the exact same products produced for England and Australia. We'll come back to Australia with the next catalog, which is by Archibald, Smyth, and Stevens from 1905. Now, the first catalog, Bradbury and Thornborough, was fairly straightforward. Here's our products and a little bit about them. Waygood and Otis, there's a lot of what they would have considered sort of educational material. Here's how our hydraulic lifts work. Here's why we want you to buy our direct plunger lift. Archibald, Smyth, and Stevens were very direct notes on electric lifts. Remember, 1905, in the marketplace, hydraulic lifts were the dominant thing. Electric lifts, 1905, are just really coming onto the market in a major way. And this is an educational piece. Yes, it's a catalog, but the text is all about, here's how these things work, here are their advantages, and we'll come to that. So hence notes, and in fact, this is the third edition of this catalog. Like Waygood, they were all throughout the UK, Scotland, Dublin, and again, Holland. Again, there's a connection here that I don't know anything about, why British companies had such, and they had representatives in Holland marketing their lifts, so there's something there. And Archibald, Smyth, and Stevens had two connections in Australia, one by 1905 with what became John's Waygood, which is what Waygood transitioned to in Australia. The first page, and for students of sort of business and commerce, this has to be, from my mind, it's one of the best written catalogs because it's very clever, because it begins with a record of actual results. And if you read through that text, it has very clear phrases such as a record of results actually obtained in practice. It talks about if you're a careful purchaser. It talks about practice versus promises, actual records and observed results. It's a very, very clever paragraph. It's all about we have real evidence, and the subtext is, of course, our competitors probably not so much. It's filled with a series of illustrations throughout. This is the one-ton goods lift. I'll just go through these very quickly because there's something very interesting about them. So there's this lift machine, 1903, the motor and gearing for a small goods lift, and they're all photographs. We have a passenger lift with what they call an artwork cage, and then another lift for a single-phase alternating current machine. Now, one of the things, if we go back, you'll notice about all of these, we have no idea where they are. They're all sitting on the same floor. Doesn't change. Now, in the 19th century, you could actually do lots of things with photographs. We tend to think we're very clever with Photoshop today. You could do all sorts of things with photographs, but these are presented like they're on a showroom floor. Like you would go to an automobile dealership and sort of see the cars. Here are our lift engines. The only thing missing is someone standing there doing this, pointing to them. The text is important and the image is important, but this really sums up their argument and the strength of this catalog. We have the type of lift down the far left-hand side, electric, and then a variety of hydraulic machines, the load, the source of power. The source of power was mentioned as an issue earlier, and as we read through this in 1905, we come here, it says private supply. 1905, it wasn't unusual for some large buildings to supply their own electricity. They'd have their own generator in the basement, and there was because there were very few commercial grids. And so if you're planning a lift design, you had to plan for, well, where is the power coming from? And also, it was very difficult to gauge at this time how much power you had available. So we see the various sources here, including the London Hydraulic Power Co., which was very well known. But it's this section, the remarks, that I think is the most interesting, is they're very careful about where their data comes from. This was observed, calculated from a published scale. So it was a published record that they used, but observed for their electric lift. Observed for their lift. Observed for their lift. And then observed for their competitors, so they can say, perhaps with some certainty, we know this is accurate, we've been to the site, we've observed the machine and recorded it, and it's very difficult to translate economic values from one period to another, but we're looking at the number of trips per penny. So 13 or 15, and clearly the electric lifts come out far ahead of their hydraulic competitors, and that was their argument. They're so much more efficient to run. Another example of one of the tables included, and again, a wonderful commercial statement that is very definitive and very clever, because it says the only conclusion possible is that the electric lift is relatively a most economical machine as regards power. That's a brilliant statement, because the one word, the qualifier, relatively. It sounds very convincing, but there's an escape clause. So it's the perfect advertising pitch. And the catalog also discusses how the lift should be driven, direct coupled or geared. Another example of a machine. And then they have, toward the end, again, for purchasers. So what are the essentials as a good lift? The translation of what they say is, well, obviously the lift we've just been talking about for the previous 23 pages, ours. Ours is what defines the best lift. They also claim to be the only wholly built British electric lift. This is 1905. Otis is making some inroads, so they're also trying to position themselves from a nationalistic point of view. They include, and I know these are probably very difficult to read, sort of short letters from satisfied clients, and sort of page after page of this as well. In this particular example, and as a researcher and somebody who's created an archive of this, every once in a while you hope you get sort of lucky in a sense, not just to find this, but it's very difficult to see. There's some sort of writing at the top. Well, if we zoom in, and it's a little difficult to read with the light washing, this says office copy, and after staring at that for a long time, I realized that's the abbreviation for William Swinburne, who was an English engineer, reasonably well known, very good hydraulic engineer, immigrated to Australia, and was a director of Johns and Waygood for the last several years of his life, and somehow I end up with his catalog. The last catalog I'd like to discuss is William Wadsworth and Sons from 1920. It's about 170 pages long, has over 170 illustrations in the catalog of everything from individual components to lifts. This is the catalog. It's very handsomely designed. Lifts, transporters, and hoists, covers a wide range. Located in Bolton. So we see electric lifts, belt-driven, transporters, friction hoists, everything. And what you can't see in the published proceedings for the symposium is, in fact, it has these several, not many, but wonderful color illustrations of both. And although it's a bit fanciful in how it's arranged, but there's a wonderful illustration of the lift engine and then the car as well as illustrations of individual cars. Well, Wadsworth also, like Archibald, Smyth, and Stevens, tried to educate their clients, and the first several pages are filled with text, including pages like this, and we see the phrase, a caution. And if we zoom in on that, they're railing against competitors who play at being lift engineers, because they just gather bits and pieces and say, look, we built a lift, and then they put it on the market. They're not serious and not seriously engaged. And while we might say something similar today, I doubt many of us would warn our customers that their experience could be sad. Perhaps expensive, but perhaps not sad. The catalog also includes, and there's a good illustration of this in the proceedings, very detailed drawings of standard sizes. And what's intriguing about these is they're all measured from the inside of the lift shaft. But they've got, for a variety of different settings, including for, I'm sort of looking at, I want to say lift number 4, they're saying one option here is you could have a door on all 3 sides if you wanted to, showing the flexibility of the product. But it also is one of the examples you can find about detailed information about lift sizes and the standards that they were proposing at the time. Catalog's divided into 3 primary sections. This is the introductory page 2. They're electric passenger lifts, again, reminding us where they're supposed to be used. It has a series of wonderful illustrations, photographs of lifts, actual lifts that were built, and something I've not commented on before is the page, in fact, is very well designed. Lift car here, the ropes going up across the shiv and all the way down to the motor. So if we sort of zoom in on that, and I knew this was going to be too faint in this light, so I apologize. But if we take a closer look at the drawing of the motor, it's a very clear line diagram, and we very quickly realize that is this same engine motor that was illustrated earlier, which is in itself a remarkable image. And you could look at it, and all of the pieces are there. All of the components are there to understand exactly how this would have worked. For their goods lifts, they have a similar series of illustrations, including many showing lifts in the cleanest mechanical rooms and spaces I've ever seen in my life. Because including this, a lift good in a basement, Then they have a section on transporters, which is not something that we typically talk about. As a reminder, a transporter is that. And in fact, in David's presentation on canals, we saw just the sort of top of one coming over, unloading a canal. And here's one in an industrial setting. And I'm guessing 1920 for the catalog, giving our friend here. So we see that coming out for unloading the wagon in that sense. But the strength of this, and well, I forgot I put that in. When we get to this section, the border changes. And instead of a car, we have a lorry, and we have a bale, and we have the transporter. But tucked away in the left-hand corner is a very nice line drawing of a belt-driven freight hoist. And the reason I pause on this, the first lift designed for the first mechanical lift designed was in fact built in the UK for a textile mill in Belper. And we think, okay, so what? 1802. That's what's important about that statement. I realize the importance of Elijah Otis's safety, 1851. He doesn't build his safety if he doesn't have a hoist to put it on. The first mechanical hoist is built in England. It operates, it's a belt-driven hoist. It's very similar in its concept to that technology. We see the belt shippers there. The strength of this catalog then is it's filled with these incredible illustrations, both of a variety of lifts in actual settings. We see the bench, the controller, a very happy guy at a paperworks, and then very detailed illustrations of machines. And only a few of these of machine rooms. And one of the things that at least strikes me about this, and this may be more familiar to you, and it's that this is, if you zoom in, you can read it. This says, pull out, to cut off power, pull out knob. So that's what that's telling us. But what surprised me about this is, again, it's ridiculously clean, but also that all of the conduit for the electrical wire. You would not have found that in the States at this time period. It would have looked much, much worse. But we can, in fact, sort of dissect that and understand what's going on. Finally, Bolton, like Archibald, Smyth, and Stevens, were sort of proudly British. And throughout their catalog, in bold, at about 8 different places, they put, I think the phrase was, well, we'll go, and I got ahead of myself, industrial lifts. If you're interested in these, wonderful photographs of how these lifts worked. And the phrase British built throughout, just to sort of remind us. Of course, by 1920, Waygood Otis was going strong, and they had to fight back in some way. What you probably can't read here, but you might guess here, and with the figure standing here, this is a Wadsworth electric lift installed especially at a northern works for the royal visit. The elevator was used by their majesties, the king and queen. But where would the operator have stood if all those seats are filled and we have no idea where the controller is? So there's a story here, and I trying to find out where. I have no idea what northern works or factory this was and when this was, but we get that. And finally, on the back of the catalog, Wadsworth's, what became one of their commercial catchphrases, which sums up a lot of what we could say about the British lift industry, the late 19th and early 20th century. They were, of course, always at your service. Thank you.